In the isolated expanse of the Gulf of Mexico, the Oceanus oil platform extracts black gold from the seabed, a tempting target for those who operate outside the law. When a ruthless cartel pirate group seizes the floating rig for a hefty ransom, they believe they've struck an easy score. But the platform's lone systems engineer isn't just tech support. Elias Vance is a decorated former Marine Corps veteran with a past they couldn't possibly imagine. What begins as a standard hijacking will soon ignite an explosive battle as Vance transforms the Oceanus into an impenetrable fortress ready to unleash a storm of his own against the invaders. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The salt-laced wind whipped across the deck of the Oceanus, carrying the metallic tang of crude oil and the distant cries of gulls. Elias Vance, his hands calloused and stained with grease despite the pristine condition of the platform's control systems, leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of the Gulf of Mexico. He was a man carved from granite, his movements economical and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, holding a quiet intensity that belied his unassuming role as the platform's sole systems engineer. The Oceanus was a behemoth of steel and technology, a floating island extracting black gold from the seabed miles from the nearest coastline. It was usually a hive of activity, but a recent maintenance cycle had reduced the crew to a skeleton staff. Elias was one of them, tasked with keeping the platform's vital systems running smoothly until the main crew returned. He enjoyed the solitude, the rhythmic hum of the machinery, a comforting counterpoint to the vast emptiness surrounding them. He'd seen a lot of emptiness in his life. The deserts of Iraq, the unforgiving landscapes of Afghanistan, places where the only company was the wind and the ever-present threat. He'd left that life behind, trading his rifle for wrenches and his combat boots for steel-toed work boots. But the training, the ingrained reflexes, the unwavering vigilance, those remained, etched into his very being. A sudden, jarring clang echoed from the lower deck, followed by shouts that were too sharp, too panicked to be routine. Elias straightened, his senses immediately on high alert. He moved with a swiftness that surprised even himself, his hand instinctively reaching for the multi-tool clipped to his belt. A poor substitute for the M16 he once carried, but better than nothing. He reached the main deck just as a group of men, their faces masked by balaclavas and their hands gripping automatic weapons, swarmed the bridge. Their movements were practiced, brutal. They barked orders in Spanish, their voices thick with menace. Todos al suelo, nadie se mueva. Everyone on the ground. Nobody move. The few remaining crew members, caught completely off guard, scrambled to obey, their faces etched with terror. Elias, however, remained standing, his eyes scanning the intruders, cataloging their numbers, their weapons, their tactics. There were at least 10 of them, heavily armed and clearly experienced. This wasn't a random act of piracy. This was a coordinated assault. One of the masked figures, taller and broader than the others, with a distinctive skull tattoo peeking from beneath his balaclava, strode towards Elias, his weapon leveled. "You, engineer? Where is the captain?" he demanded, his English heavily accented. Elias met his gaze unflinchingly. "Captain's on shore leave. I'm in charge of systems." The pirate sneered. "Then you will do. We are taking this platform. Cooperate and you might live." He gestured to his men. "Secure the perimeter. Find the communications room." Panic began to bubble in the chests of the captured crew, but Elias felt a cold, calculating calm settle over him. He knew what these men wanted. Ransom. A platform like the Oceanus was worth a fortune, and the oil it produced even more. As the pirates began to herd the crew towards the mess hall, Elias subtly shifted his weight, positioning himself near a heavy steel door that led to the platform's lower levels, the labyrinthine network of pipes, pumps, and machinery that was his domain. "Move!" the tattooed pirate barked, shoving Elias forward. Elias moved, but not in the direction the pirate intended. With a sudden burst of speed, He sidestepped the shove and slammed his shoulder into the pirate's chest, sending him stumbling back. Before the other pirates could react, Elias had wrenched open the steel door and disappeared into the dimly lit corridor beyond, the heavy door clanging shut behind him. The pirates roared in frustration, pounding on the thick steel. "Break it down!" the tattooed pirate yelled. "Find him!" Elias didn't waste a second. He knew the Oceanus like the back of his hand. Every pipe, every valve, every access panel. He moved through the narrow corridors with the agility of a rat in a maze, his mind racing, formulating a plan. His first priority was to cut off their communications. The platform had a satellite uplink, and if the pirates managed to use it, they could solidify their control and make their demands. He needed to reach the comms room before they did. He navigated the network of stairs and walkways, the rhythmic thumping of the platform beneath his feet a familiar comfort in the sudden chaos. He could hear the pirates' heavy footsteps echoing above him, their shouts growing fainter as he descended deeper into the platform's belly. He reached the comms room door, a reinforced steel hatch with a keypad lock. He quickly punched in the access code, the green light flashing momentarily before the door hissed open. Inside, the room was a tangle of wires, screens, and humming equipment. 2 pirates were already there, fiddling with the controls. Elias didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his multi-tool flashing in his hand. The first pirate barely had time to register his presence before Elias's improvised weapon slammed into his temple, sending him crashing to the floor. The second pirate spun around, his eyes wide with shock, but Elias was already on him, disarming him with a swift movement and then using the butt of the pirate's own rifle to deliver a disabling blow to the chest. He quickly secured the door from the inside, then turned his attention to the communications console. He needed to disable the satellite uplink, but he also needed to maintain a local network for his own purposes. He worked quickly, his fingers flying across the keyboard, rerouting connections and isolating systems. Within minutes, the platform's external communications were down. The pirates were effectively cut off from the outside world. Elias allowed himself a grim smile. Round 1 to the engineer. But he knew this was just the beginning. The pirates would be furious when they realized their comms were down, and they would be hunting for him with renewed intensity. He needed to disappear to become a ghost in the machine, using the platform itself as his weapon. He slipped out of the comms room through a rarely used maintenance hatch, finding himself in a narrow crawl space that ran along the platform's main support structure. It was cramped and dusty, but it offered a hidden pathway through the platform. He moved silently through the darkness, his senses straining for any sound of the pirates. He could hear their frustrated shouts echoing above him, their heavy boots pounding on the metal decks. They were searching for him, but they were doing it blindly. Elias reached a junction in the crawlspace, where a narrow shaft led upwards. He knew it opened into the platform's ventilation system. It was a risky move, but it offered a way to move around undetected. He squeezed through the opening and found himself in a large ventilation duct, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. He began to crawl, the metal walls cold against his skin. He could hear the muffled sounds of the pirates moving below him, their voices occasionally drifting up through the vents. "Did you find him?" "No, damn it. He's like a rat in a maze. The boss is going to be furious." Elias pressed on, his mind working furiously. He needed to create chaos, to sow discord among the pirates. He needed to make them feel like they were being hunted, not the hunters. He reached a vent that overlooked the platform's main control room, a large, glass-walled space where the platform's vital operations were monitored. He could see several pirates inside, their attention focused on the banks of screens. An idea sparked in his mind. He knew the platform's fire suppression system was extensive, designed to quickly douse any potential oil fires. It was controlled remotely from the main control room. He carefully pried open the vent cover, just enough to get a clear view of the control panel. He could see the button for the fire suppression system, a large red square labeled Emergency. He took a deep breath and then, Using a piece of stiff wire he found in the vent, he carefully reached down and pressed the button. A moment of silence, then a deafening roar filled the control room as high-pressure nozzles deployed from the ceiling, spraying a deluge of fire-retardant foam. The pirates inside screamed in surprise and confusion, scrambling to get out of the way of the sudden downpour. Elias watched with grim satisfaction as the control room was quickly filled with thick, white foam, obscuring the screens and disabling the equipment. He quickly replaced the vent cover and continued his crawl through the ventilation system, the sounds of chaos echoing behind him. The pirates would be furious, but they wouldn't know what had hit them. They would be scrambling to deal with the mess, their attention diverted from finding him. It bought him precious time. His next goal was to secure a defensible position, somewhere he could hold out against them. He thought of the platform's engine room, a massive, heavily shielded compartment deep within the structure. It had thick steel walls, reinforced doors, and its own independent ventilation system. It was designed to withstand almost anything. He changed direction in the ventilation system, heading towards the engine room. The crawl was slow and uncomfortable, but he knew it was his best chance. As he moved, he considered his limited resources. He had his multi-tool, his wits, and his knowledge of the platform. That was it. He needed to improvise, to use the environment to his advantage. He reached another vent, this one overlooking a corridor where he could hear the pirates' heavy footsteps approaching. He peered through the slats and saw 3 of them, their weapons raised, their faces grim. He needed to slow them down. He remembered the platform's automated welding system, used for repairs on the pipelines. It was controlled remotely and could generate intense heat. He knew there was a control panel for the welding system located in a nearby maintenance closet, accessible from the ventilation shaft. He crawled towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. He found the access panel, a small metal door secured with a simple latch. He carefully opened it and peered inside. The maintenance closet was small and cramped, but he could see the control panel for the welding system mounted on the wall. He reached inside and activated the system, setting the welding arm to maximum power. He then carefully positioned the arm so that it would swing out into the corridor when activated remotely. He retreated back into the ventilation shaft and waited, listening to the pirates approaching. When they were directly below him, he activated the welding arm. With a loud hiss and a shower of sparks, the arm swung out into the corridor, blocking their path. The pirates yelled in surprise, scrambling back as the intense heat radiated outwards. Elias watched with satisfaction as they retreated, their progress halted by his improvised obstacle. He had bought himself more time. He continued his crawl towards the engine room, his body aching from the confined space and the constant tension. He knew the pirates would eventually overcome his obstacles, but every delay gave him a better chance of turning the tables on them. He finally reached the ventilation shaft that led to the engine room. He could hear the deep rumble of the massive engines below, a reassuring sound in the midst of the chaos. He carefully removed the vent cover and dropped down into the engine room. It was a vast, cavernous space filled with towering machinery and a constant low-frequency hum. The air was thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. He was alone. He quickly secured the heavy steel door leading into the engine room, then began to assess his surroundings. The engine room had its own independent power supply, water purification system, and even a small emergency medical kit. It was designed to be self-sufficient in case of emergencies. He found a locker containing some basic tools and a few spare parts. He also located a heavy-duty fire extinguisher, which could serve as a makeshift weapon. He knew the pirates would eventually find their way down here. He needed to prepare for their arrival to turn the engine room into a fortress. His first priority was to secure all the entrances. There were 2 main doors, both made of thick steel and secured with heavy bolts. He checked them carefully, ensuring they were locked and reinforced. He then began to think about how he could use the engine room's machinery to his advantage. The massive engines generated a tremendous amount of heat and noise. He could use that to disorient and confuse the pirates. He also knew that the engine room had a complex network of pipes carrying high-pressure steam and oil. If he could rupture one of those pipes, it could create a dangerous and chaotic situation. He started to formulate a plan, his mind working quickly and efficiently, drawing on his years of training and experience. He was no longer just a systems engineer. He was a Marine, and he was ready to fight. He found a heavy wrench and began to work, tightening bolts, securing hatches, and preparing his defenses. The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the air, a constant reminder of the power at his disposal. He knew the odds were stacked against him. He was just one man against a group of heavily armed pirates. But he had the advantage of knowing the platform, of being in his element. And he had something else, the unwavering determination of a man who had faced danger before and survived. He was ready to make the Oceanus his battlefield. Hours passed. The platform remained eerily silent, save for the constant hum of the engines. Elias had used the time to his advantage, turning the engine room into a veritable fortress. He had barricaded the doors with heavy machinery, rigged makeshift alarms using tripwires and tools, and even created a few booby traps using the engine room's equipment. He had also found a small stash of emergency rations and water, enough to last him for a few days. He knew this wouldn't be a quick fight. Suddenly, a loud banging echoed from the main door. The pirates had finally found their way to the engine room. "Engineer, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up, and we might let you live." The tattooed pirate's voice boomed through the thick steel. Elias remained silent, his hand gripping the heavy wrench he had chosen as his primary weapon. He was positioned behind a large engine block, hidden from view. The banging continued, growing more insistent. Then, the sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air. The pirates were trying to force the door open. Elias knew the door was strong, but it wouldn't hold forever. He needed to be ready. The grinding stopped, followed by a loud thud. The door shuddered but held. "All right, plan B," the pirate's voice said. "Find another way in." Elias knew there was another access point, a smaller maintenance hatch on the opposite side of the engine room. He had anticipated this and had already set a trap. He had positioned a large metal drum filled with heavy tools directly behind the hatch. If the pirates tried to open it, the drum would fall, creating a loud noise and potentially injuring whoever was on the other side. He waited, his senses on high alert. He could hear the pirates moving around outside, their voices muffled by the thick walls. Then, he heard the faint sound of the maintenance hatch being jiggled. The pirates had found it. He tensed, ready to react. The latch clicked, and the hatch began to swing inwards. As it did, the metal drum behind it shifted, then toppled over with a deafening crash, sending tools scattering across the floor. A startled yell came from the other side of the hatch, followed by a string of angry Spanish curses. Elias grinned grimly. Trap sprung. He heard the pirates outside shouting to each other, their voices filled with frustration. They were clearly not expecting this kind of resistance. The main door suddenly shuddered again, this time with more force. The pirates were using something heavier now, probably a breaching tool. Elias knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He needed to take the fight to them, to disrupt their efforts and keep them off balance. He moved silently through the engine room, his eyes scanning the network of pipes overhead. He had an idea, a risky one, but it might just work. He climbed onto a platform overlooking the main engine, reaching for a large valve on a high-pressure steam pipe. He knew that if he opened this valve suddenly, it would release a scalding jet of steam, creating a wall of heat and obscuring visibility. He waited until he heard the pirates redoubling their efforts on the main door, the sounds of their breaching tool echoing loudly. Then, with a grunt, he wrenched the valve open. A deafening hiss filled the engine room as a thick cloud of steam erupted from the pipe, instantly reducing visibility to near zero. The heat was intense, even from where Elias was standing. He heard shouts of panic from the other side of the door as the pirates were caught in the blast of steam. He quickly jumped down from the platform and moved through the swirling vapor, using the chaos to his advantage. He knew the pirates wouldn't be able to see him, but he could hear their movements. He used the sounds to guide him, moving silently through the steam-filled space. He bumped into something solid, one of the pirates, disoriented and coughing in the steam. Elias didn't hesitate. He swung his heavy wrench, connecting with a sickening thud. The pirate collapsed to the floor without a sound. Elias moved on, his senses straining through the steam. He could hear another pirate nearby, fumbling with his weapon. Elias moved towards the sound, his wrench raised. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his arm, pulling him off balance. He spun around, his wrench swinging wildly, but his attacker was too close. He felt a sharp pain in his side as a knife grazed his skin. He roared in pain and swung his wrench again, this time connecting with his attacker's head. The pirate stumbled back, dropping his knife. Elias pressed his hand to his bleeding side, the steam around him momentarily clearing. He saw two pirates lying on the floor, unconscious or worse. The third pirate, the one who had stabbed him, was staggering back, clutching his head. Before the pirate could recover, Elias lunged forward and brought his wrench down again, ending the fight. He stood there, panting, the steam slowly dissipating, revealing the scene of chaos. 3 pirates down. But he was wounded, and he knew there were more of them. He needed to get out of the engine room to find a safer place to regroup and tend to his wound. He knew there was a rarely used emergency escape tunnel that led from the engine room to the platform's exterior, near the helipad. It was a long shot, but it was his only option. He found the entrance to the tunnel, a small, inconspicuous hatch hidden behind a bank of machinery. He opened it and slipped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, the air thick with the smell of damp metal. He crawled through the darkness, his side throbbing with pain. He didn't know how long the tunnel was, or where exactly it would lead him, but he had to keep moving. He could hear the faint sounds of the pirates shouting in the engine room behind him. They would realize he was gone soon enough and would be searching for him. He pressed on, driven by adrenaline and the will to survive. He had to make it out of this. He had to turn this platform back into his sanctuary. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness broken only by the occasional drip of water. Elias's wound was bleeding steadily, and he was starting to feel lightheaded. He finally saw a faint light ahead. He crawled towards it, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The tunnel opened into a small, enclosed space, the platform's emergency generator room. The room was dimly lit by a single bare bulb, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel. Elias pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky. He leaned against a generator, catching his breath. He needed to find something to stop the bleeding. He spotted a small first aid kit mounted on the wall. He quickly opened it and found some bandages and antiseptic. He cleaned his wound as best he could and then wrapped it tightly. He took a moment to assess his surroundings. The generator room was small but secure, with a heavy steel door leading to the outside. There was also a small radio transceiver on a nearby workbench, used for emergency communication. He tried to turn it on, but it was dead. The pirates must have disabled the platform's main power supply. The emergency generator was running, providing limited power, but it wasn't enough for the radio. He needed to find a way to restore power to the radio, or find another way to contact the outside world. He knew there was a backup antenna located on the platform's helipad, connected to a separate, smaller transmitter in the helipad control room. If he could reach the helipad, he might be able to send out a distress signal. But the helipad was on the top deck, exposed and likely guarded by the pirates. Getting there would be extremely dangerous. He looked at the steel door leading outside. It was locked, but he thought he could probably force it open with the tools he had. He made a decision. He had to take the risk. Staying in the generator room was just delaying the inevitable. He needed to act. He grabbed a heavy pry bar from the workbench and went to the door. He inserted the bar into the gap between the door and the frame and began to pry. The metal groaned under the strain, but the door held. He tried again, putting all his weight into it. This time, with a loud screech, the door buckled slightly. He continued to pry, his muscles screaming in protest, until finally, with a loud crack, the locking mechanism gave way. He cautiously pushed the door open, peering outside. He found himself on a narrow walkway that ran along the side of the platform, several stories above the churning water. The wind whipped around him, carrying the salty spray of the ocean. He could see the helipad in the distance, a large circular platform at the far end of the walkway. There were a few figures moving around on it, the pirates. He needed to find a way to get there without being seen. He looked around for cover. The walkway was mostly exposed, but there were a few large pipes and ventilation shafts that he could use to conceal his movements. He took a deep breath and stepped out onto the walkway, keeping low and moving quickly from one piece of cover to the next. The wind howled in his ears, making it difficult to hear. He scanned the helipad, trying to determine the pirates' positions. There seemed to be at least 3 of them, armed and alert. He reached a large ventilation shaft and crouched behind it, catching his breath. He was about halfway to the helipad. Suddenly, he heard a shout. "Hey, over there! I saw something!" One of the pirates on the helipad had spotted him. He raised his weapon and started firing. Bullets whizzed past Elias, pinging off the metal of the ventilation shaft. He ducked down, his heart pounding in his chest. He was exposed. He needed to move, and fast. He sprinted towards the next piece of cover, a large pipe running along the edge of the walkway. He could hear the pirates shouting and firing at him. He reached the pipe and threw himself behind it, the bullets thudding into the metal just inches away. He was pinned down, with no way to reach the helipad without crossing a large open area. He needed a distraction. He looked around frantically, trying to find something he could use. His eyes fell on a nearby emergency flare gun, mounted on the wall. He grabbed it and quickly loaded a flare. He aimed it towards the far end of the platform, away from the helipad, and fired. The flare shot out with a loud whoosh, leaving a trail of bright orange smoke. It exploded in the distance, creating a brilliant flash of light. The pirates on the helipad turned their attention towards the flare, momentarily distracted. It was the opportunity Elias needed. He sprinted out from behind the pipe, running as fast as he could towards the helipad. The pirates quickly realized they had been tricked and turned back, firing at him again. But he was already close to the helipad, his legs pumping furiously. He reached the edge of the platform and scrambled onto it, diving behind a stack of supplies. Bullets rained down around him, kicking up sparks from the metal deck. He was on the helipad, but he was still pinned down and outnumbered. He needed to reach the control room, a small structure located on the far side of the helipad. That's where the backup transmitter was located. He crawled behind the stack of supplies, trying to stay out of the line of fire. He could hear the pirates moving towards him, their footsteps echoing on the metal deck. He needed a weapon, and fast. He looked around desperately, his eyes landing on a fire axe mounted on the wall of the control room. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing he had. He took a deep breath and made a run for it, sprinting across the open space towards the control room. The pirates opened fire, the bullets whizzing past him. He felt a searing pain in his leg as one grazed his flesh, but he kept running, his eyes fixed on the fire axe. He reached the control room and grabbed the axe, pulling it from its mount. Felt heavy and solid in his hands. He turned to face the pirates, his eyes blazing with defiance. He was wounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, but he was not beaten. He was ready to fight to the last man. The pirates advanced cautiously, their weapons raised. They could see the determination in his eyes, the unwavering resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. The standoff lasted for a tense moment, the only sound the howling wind and the distant roar of the ocean. Then one of the pirates made a move, raising his rifle to fire. Elias reacted instantly. He swung the fire axe with all his might, the heavy blade whistling through the air. It struck the pirate in the chest with a sickening thud, sending him crashing to the ground. The other pirates hesitated, momentarily stunned. Elias used the opportunity to charge, swinging the axe again and again, a whirlwind of fury and desperation. He managed to take down another pirate before they could react. The third pirate, seeing his comrades fall, turned and fled towards the edge of the helipad. Elias didn't hesitate. He threw the fire axe, the heavy weapon spinning through the air and striking the fleeing pirate in the back. He stumbled and fell, disappearing over the edge of the platform. Elias stood there, panting, the fire axe lying on the deck beside him. He was wounded and exhausted, but he had survived. He had taken down 3 heavily armed pirates with nothing but a fire axe and his bare hands. He quickly limped into the control room and found the backup transmitter. It was a small, rugged device, powered by its own independent battery. He turned it on and began to transmit a distress signal, giving his location and a brief description of the situation. He didn't know if anyone would receive it, but he had to try. He repeated the message several times, his voice hoarse and strained. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he heard a faint voice crackle over the speaker. "Platform Oceanus, this is Coast Guard Vessel Sentinel. We read you. Please confirm your situation." Relief washed over Elias in a wave so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had done it. He had contacted the outside world. "This is Systems Engineer Elias Vance," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "The platform has been taken over by armed pirates. I repeat, the platform has been taken over by armed pirates. We need immediate assistance." The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "Roger that, Oceanus. We are en route. ETA approximately 4 hours. Can you hold your position?" For hours. Felt like an eternity, but he had held out this long. He could hold out for 4 more hours. "Affirmative," Elias said. "I will defend the platform until you arrive." He knew the pirates who had attacked the bridge were still out there, and they would be furious when they realized he had contacted the authorities. They would be coming for him. He grabbed the fire axe again, his grip tightening on the handle. He might be wounded and tired, but he was not going to surrender. He had turned the Oceanus into his fortress, and he would defend it to the bitter end. He looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean, the wind whipping around him. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. It was a new day, but the fight was far from over. He knew the pirates would regroup, and they would be coming for him with everything they had. He needed to prepare for their attack, to use every ounce of his knowledge of the platform to his advantage. He thought about the platform's layout, the network of pipes and machinery, the various control systems. He had spent years working on this platform, and he knew it intimately. He could use it against them. He remembered the platform's ballast control system, used to adjust the platform's stability. It was controlled remotely from the main control room. Even though the control room was compromised, there might be a manual override somewhere. He limped back into the helipad control room and began to search. He found a set of schematics for the ballast system tucked away in a drawer. He studied them quickly, his eyes scanning the diagrams. He found what he was looking for, a manual control panel located in the platform's pump room, deep within the structure. It was a long shot, but if he could reach it, he might be able to use it to his advantage. He knew the pump room was located near the engine room, where he had his first confrontation with the pirates. It was likely still crawling with them, but he had no other options. He needed to create a diversion, something to throw the pirates off balance while he made his way to the pump room. He looked at the emergency flare gun again. He had 1 flare left. He could use it to create a bright flash and a loud bang, hopefully disorienting the pirates long enough for him to slip away. He went back out onto the helipad and scanned the area. He didn't see any signs of the remaining pirates. They were likely regrouping below deck. He aimed the flare gun towards the main deck entrance and fired. The flare shot out, exploding with a brilliant flash and a loud report. He didn't wait to see the pirates' reaction. He turned and ran towards the nearest access ladder, leading down to the lower levels of the platform. He descended quickly, his wounded leg protesting with every step. He moved through the deserted corridors, his senses on high alert. He could hear faint shouts in the distance, indicating that the pirates had heard the flare and were likely investigating. He reached the engine room level and moved cautiously towards the pump room. He could hear voices ahead, confirming his suspicions. The pirates were still in the area. He needed to find a way to get past them without being seen. He remembered a series of narrow maintenance tunnels that ran alongside the main corridors. He might be able to use them to bypass the pirates. He found the entrance to the tunnels, a small hatch hidden behind a bank of pipes. He squeezed through the opening and found himself in a dark, cramped space. He moved slowly through the tunnel, his hands feeling along the cold metal walls. He could hear the pirates' voices nearby, sometimes just inches away on the other side of the metal. He finally reached a point directly above the pump room. He could hear the distinct sound of pumps and machinery below. He found a small access panel in the floor of the tunnel and carefully pried it open. He peered down into the pump room. He could see at least 2 pirates inside, their weapons slung over their shoulders as they examined the equipment. He needed to get down there without alerting them. He looked around the tunnel and spotted a heavy chain hanging from a support beam. It was used for lifting equipment. He carefully lowered himself onto the chain and began to descend slowly, hand over hand. The metal was cold and slippery, and his wounded leg made it difficult to maintain his grip. He finally reached the bottom of the shaft and dropped silently onto the floor of the pump room, landing behind a large pump. The 2 pirates were still on the other side of the room, their backs to him. He moved quickly and silently, grabbing a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox. He crept up behind the nearest pirate and brought the wrench down on his head, knocking him unconscious. The other pirate spun around, startled by the sudden noise. Elias didn't give him a chance to react. He lunged forward, tackling the pirate to the ground and disarming him. A brief struggle ensued, but Elias's marine training quickly took over. He subdued the pirate and tied him up with some rope he found nearby. He was in the pump room. Now he needed to find the manual control panel for the ballast system. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on a large metal cabinet labeled Ballast Control, Manual Override. He quickly opened it and found a series of levers and gauges. He studied the labels, his mind racing. He needed to figure out how to manipulate the ballast tanks to destabilize the platform, making it difficult for the pirates to move around and potentially even causing them to lose their footing. He began to experiment with the levers, watching the gauges carefully. He could feel the platform subtly shifting beneath his feet. He continued to adjust the controls, gradually increasing the instability. He could hear shouts and the sounds of things falling over in other parts of the platform. His plan was working. He continued to manipulate the ballast controls, making the platform rock more violently. He could hear the pirates yelling in frustration as they tried to maintain their balance. Suddenly, the door to the pump room burst open, and the tattooed pirate leader stood there, his face contorted with rage. "You! What are you doing?" he roared, raising his weapon. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby fire axe and charged at the pirate leader. The pirate fired his weapon, but Elias ducked and weaved, closing the distance quickly. He swung the fire axe, aiming for the pirate's legs. The pirate jumped back, narrowly avoiding the blow. He fired again, and this time a bullet grazed Elias's arm. Elias ignored the pain and continued his attack, swinging the axe with all his might. The pirate leader was skilled and agile, dodging his blows and firing back. The fight was fierce and brutal, the confined space of the pump room amplifying the sounds of their struggle. Elias was wounded and tired, but he was fueled by adrenaline and the determination to protect the platform. Finally, he saw an opening. As the pirate leader lunged forward with his knife, Elias sidestepped and brought the fire axe down in a powerful arc. The blade struck the pirate leader in the shoulder, severing muscle and bone. He roared in pain and dropped his knife, clutching his injured arm. Elias pressed his advantage, swinging the axe again. This time, The blade found its mark, and the pirate leader collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Elias stood over him, panting, the fire axe dripping with blood. He had taken down the leader. He quickly secured the pump room door and returned to the ballast control panel. He needed to make the platform even more unstable. He adjusted the levers again, increasing the rocking motion. He could hear the pirates above deck screaming as they struggled to stay on their feet. He knew the Coast Guard would be arriving soon. He just needed to hold out a little longer. He made his way back to the helipad control room and grabbed the radio transmitter. He needed to let the Coast Guard know what he had done. "Sentinel, this is Oceanus. I have destabilized the platform. The pirates are having trouble moving around." "ETA?" The voice on the other end replied, "Oceanus. Roger that. ETA now approximately 2 hours. Can you maintain control?" 2 more hours. He could do that. "Affirmative, Sentinel. I will maintain control." He looked out at the ocean, the sun now high in the sky. The platform was rocking violently, but it was still afloat. He had turned it into a fortress, and he had defended it against the invaders. He knew the fight wasn't completely over. There were still pirates on board, and they would be desperate now that their leader was down and the authorities were on their way. But Elias Vance, the former Marine engineer, was ready for them. He had faced worse odds before, and he had always come out on top. He would not let these cartel pirates take his platform. He would fight them until the very end. He gripped the fire axe, his knuckles white. He was ready for whatever came next. The Oceanus was his domain, and he would defend it with his life. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the platform, throwing Elias off his feet. The helipad control room filled with smoke and debris. He scrambled to his feet, coughing and disoriented. What had happened? He stumbled out onto the helipad and saw the horrifying truth. A large section of the platform's main deck was engulfed in flames, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. The explosion had come from below, likely from the platform's oil processing facilities. The pirates must have sabotaged the platform, knowing that their escape was unlikely. They were going to take it down with them. Elias knew that if the fire reached the oil storage tanks, the entire platform would become a floating inferno. He had to do something, and fast. He raced back into the control room and grabbed the radio transmitter. "Sentinel, this is Oceanus. We have a major fire on board. Explosion in the processing unit. We need immediate fire suppression." The response was immediate. "Oceanus, roger that. We are diverting our assets. ETA remains 2 hours. Can you contain the fire?" 2 hours was too long. The fire was spreading rapidly. He could see pirates emerging from below deck, their faces grim. They knew their time was running out. Elias knew he had to act quickly. He remembered the platform's emergency shutdown procedures, designed to isolate the oil flow in case of a major incident. If he could activate the shutdown, he might be able to contain the fire. The main control panel for the shutdown was located in the now-burning section of the platform. Getting there was suicide, but he knew there was a secondary control panel located in the engine room, the same room where he had his first major confrontation with the pirates. It was a long shot, but it was his only hope. He grabbed the fire axe and raced towards the nearest access ladder, heading down into the burning platform. Smoke filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. The heat was intense. He moved quickly through the corridors, dodging flames and falling debris. He could hear the panicked shouts of the pirates around him. He reached the engine room level and made his way towards the engine room door. It was still intact, but smoke was seeping out from under the frame. He kicked the door open and stepped inside. The engine room was dimly lit by the emergency lights, the air thick with smoke. He could see the bodies of the pirates he had fought earlier, still lying on the floor. He located the secondary shutdown control panel, a large metal box mounted on the wall. He rushed towards it and began to examine the controls. There were a series of levers and buttons, labeled in technical jargon. He had to be careful. One wrong move could make things even worse. He studied the diagrams etched on the panel, his mind racing. He needed to isolate the flow of oil to the processing unit. He began to manipulate the controls, following the sequence outlined in the diagrams. He could hear the roar of the fire outside growing louder. Finally, he pulled the main isolation lever. He held his breath, waiting to see if it had worked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, he heard a series of loud thumps and hisses as valves closed throughout the platform. The roar of the fire seemed to subside slightly. He had done it. He had isolated the oil flow. The fire might still burn, but it wouldn't have any more fuel to feed on. He leaned against the control panel, exhausted and coughing. He had bought them some time. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. He grabbed the fire axe, ready for another fight. The tattooed pirate leader, his shoulder heavily bandaged, stumbled into the engine room, followed by 2 other pirates. They looked battered and desperate. "You!" the leader snarled, pointing a pistol at Elias. "You will pay for this." Elias stood his ground, the fire axe held ready. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "The Coast Guard is on their way." The pirate leader laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "We're not going down alone." He gestured to his men. "Finish him." The 2 pirates raised their weapons, but before they could fire, Elias moved. He lunged forward, swinging the fire axe in a wide arc. The first pirate barely had time to react before the heavy blade struck him in the chest, sending him sprawling. The second pirate fired his weapon, but Elias had already moved, dodging the bullets. He brought the axe down again, this time on the second pirate, ending the threat. He turned his attention to the pirate leader, who was still pointing his pistol. Elias knew he had to act fast. He threw the fire axe with all his remaining strength. The heavy weapon spun through the air, striking the pirate leader in the head. He crumpled to the ground, his pistol clattering on the metal floor. Elias stood there, panting, the engine room silent except for the crackling of the fire outside. He had done it. He had defeated the pirates. He stumbled towards the radio transmitter, his body aching. He needed to let the Coast Guard know the situation. "Sentinel, this is Oceanus. The pirates have been neutralized. The fire is contained. We are awaiting your arrival." The response came quickly. "Roger that, Oceanus. We are approaching your position now. Stand by for boarding." Elias leaned against the wall, relief washing over him. It was finally over. He had survived the impossible. He had turned the Oceanus into his fortress and defended it against a ruthless cartel. As he waited for the Coast Guard to arrive, he thought about everything that had happened. He was just a systems engineer, a man who had tried to leave his violent past behind. But when push came to shove, the Marine inside him had emerged, ready to fight and protect what was his. He knew his life would never be the same. He had faced death and emerged victorious. He had proven to himself that he was capable of more than he ever thought possible. The sound of a helicopter approaching grew louder. He made his way to the helipad, the smoke still billowing from the damaged section of the platform. A Coast Guard helicopter landed, and armed officers quickly disembarked, securing the area. They approached Elias, their faces grim but relieved. "Are you the engineer who sent the distress call?" one of them asked. Elias nodded, his body weary but his spirit unbroken. "Yes, sir. Elias Vance." "You did one hell of a job, Mr. Vance," the officer said, extending his hand. "You saved this platform." Elias shook his hand, a small, weary smile on his face. He was just glad it was over. But as he looked out at the vast ocean, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end of the story. The cartel would not take this lightly. They would be back. And Elias Vance, the former Marine engineer, would be ready for them. The fortress of Oceanus was his now, and he would defend it again if necessary. The salt-laced wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of smoke and oil, but also a hint of something else, the steely resolve of a warrior who had found his purpose once more. The platform might be damaged, but it was still standing, and so was he. But what he didn't know was that among the pirates he had neutralized, one was not dead. merely playing possum. A small tracking device attached to his belt silently pinging a location back to the cartel, a promise of future vengeance hanging heavy in the sea air. The immediate aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, concerned faces, and the acrid smell of smoke. The Coast Guard officers secured the platform, providing medical attention to the wounded and taking custody of the surviving pirates. Elias, despite his exhaustion and injuries, insisted on giving a full debriefing, recounting the events of the past few hours. He didn't mention the pirate he suspected might still be alive, the one with the tracking device. It was a hunch, a gut feeling based on the way the man had fallen, too cleanly, too silently. He decided to keep that information to himself for now, a card to play if needed. After the debriefing, a medic insisted on treating Elias's wounds. The graze on his side and the bullet wound on his leg were superficial but needed attention. As the medic cleaned and bandaged him, Elias felt a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled him for so long was finally wearing off, leaving him feeling drained and vulnerable. The Coast Guard team began a thorough investigation of the platform, assessing the damage and collecting evidence. The fire in the processing unit had been contained, but the damage was significant. The Oceanus was no longer operational. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the smoke-stained deck, a Coast Guard cutter pulled alongside the platform. The remaining crew members, who had been held hostage in the mess hall, were escorted onto the cutter, their faces pale and shaken. Elias was offered a place on the cutter, but he declined. "Someone needs to stay with the platform," he said to the commanding officer. "I know this rig better than anyone." The officer hesitated, but seeing the determined look in Elias's eyes, he relented. A small security detail would remain on the Oceanus with Elias until a salvage crew arrived. That night, the platform was eerily quiet. The rhythmic hum of the machinery was gone, replaced by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the occasional creak of metal. Elias sat in the helipad control room, staring out at the dark expanse of the ocean. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that the danger had not completely passed. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, every decision, every fight. He knew he had done what he had to do, but the violence had taken a toll. He was no longer just Elias Vance, the systems engineer. He was someone else now, someone forged in the crucible of combat. He thought about the pirate with the tracking device. If his hunch was correct, the cartel would know that their attack had failed, but they would also know the platform's location and that he was still on board. They wouldn't let this go. He decided to take precautions. He spent the next few hours making a thorough sweep of the platform, checking every nook and cranny, every ventilation shaft and maintenance tunnel. He was looking for any sign of the supposedly neutralized pirate or any other potential threats. He found nothing, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, persisted. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and purple, a salvage tugboat appeared on the horizon, its silhouette growing larger as it approached. Relief washed over Elias, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of vigilance. The arrival of the salvage crew meant more people on the platform, more potential targets for the cartel. The salvage crew, a team of grizzled professionals, immediately began assessing the damage and preparing the Oceanus for towing. They were focused on their work, seemingly oblivious to the danger that Elias felt lurking beneath the surface. He kept his eyes open, watching everyone, every movement. He trusted no one. A few days passed without incident. The Oceanus was slowly being made ready for the long tow back to shore. The Coast Guard security detail remained on board, their presence a reassuring but ultimately insufficient deterrent against a determined cartel. Elias tried to settle back into his routine, checking the platform's remaining systems, ensuring everything was stable for the journey. But the quiet was deceptive. He knew the storm was coming. One evening, as the salvage crew prepared to secure the final towing lines, Elias noticed something out of place. A small, unmarked drone was hovering in the distance, its rotors whirring softly in the twilight. It was too far away to identify, but Elias knew instinctively that it belonged to the cartel. They were watching. He immediately alerted the Coast Guard security team. They scrambled to track the drone, but it quickly disappeared into the darkness. The incident put everyone on edge. The Coast Guard increased their patrols around the platform, and the salvage crew worked with a renewed sense of urgency. Elias knew that the cartel wouldn't risk another direct assault with the Coast Guard present. They would likely try something more subtle, more insidious. He thought about the pirate with the tracking device again. He was convinced the man was alive and was the cartel's eyes and ears on the inside. But where was he hiding? He decided to conduct another search, this time focusing on the areas that had been overlooked before. He started with the platform storage areas, large compartments filled with spare parts, tools, and other equipment. He spent hours methodically searching each area, moving heavy crates and peering into dark corners. He found nothing. Frustrated, he moved on to the platform's ventilation system. He knew it was a vast and complex network with plenty of places for someone to hide. He crawled through the narrow ducts, the dust and grime clinging to his skin. The air was stale and heavy. He called out occasionally, hoping to flush out the hidden pirate, but there was no response. He was about to give up when he noticed something unusual. In a section of the ventilation system near the engine room, a small access panel seemed to have been recently disturbed. The latch was slightly ajar, and there were faint scratch marks around the edges. His heart pounded in his chest. This had to be it. He carefully opened the panel and peered inside. The space beyond was small and dark, but he could make out the shape of a figure huddled in the corner. "I know you're in there," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Come out with your hands up." There was a moment of silence. Then a figure slowly emerged from the darkness. It was the pirate he had suspected, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes filled with a cold, hard hatred. "You should have made sure I was dead," the pirate said, his voice raspy. "I will now," Elias replied, raising his weapon. But the pirate was faster. He lunged forward, a makeshift knife flashing in his hand. Elias reacted instantly, dodging the attack and bringing his own weapon down. The fight was quick and brutal. Elias, despite his injuries, was stronger and more experienced. He quickly subdued the pirate, disarming him and securing his hands. He then examined the pirate's belt and found the small tracking device. His hunch had been right. He contacted the Coast Guard security team and informed them of his discovery. They arrived quickly and took the pirate into custody. With the hidden threat neutralized, Elias felt a sense of relief wash over him. But he knew this was not the end. The cartel would still be coming. The next morning, as the Oceanus began its slow journey back to shore, Elias stood on the deck, watching the coastline grow closer. He knew that when he reached land, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The cartel would likely put a target on his back. But he was no longer the same man who had arrived on this platform weeks ago. He had faced his past and emerged stronger. He was ready for whatever the future held. As the Oceanus entered the harbor, Elias saw a group of men waiting on the dock. They weren't in uniforms, and they didn't look like law enforcement. They had the hard, cold look of men who dealt in violence. Elias knew with a chilling certainty that the cartel had arrived. The game was far from over. This was just the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter. As he stepped off the platform onto the dock, one of the men detached himself from the group and approached him, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice smooth as silk but with an undercurrent of steel. "We've been expecting you." He gestured towards a waiting black SUV. "Our boss would like to have a word." Elias knew he had a choice to make, one that could determine his future. He could run, try to disappear, or he could face the cartel head-on. He looked back at the Oceanus, the platform that had become his fortress, a symbol of his resilience. He made his decision. "Lead the way," he said, his voice firm, the storm in his eyes returning with a vengeance. Elias followed the man to the black SUV, the silence between them thick with unspoken threats. Two more men, their eyes cold and assessing, flanked the vehicle. He was sandwiched between them in the back seat, the tinted windows offering no view of their destination. The ride was smooth and unsettlingly quiet, the only sound the low hum of the engine. After about 30 minutes, the SUV pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a nondescript office building. The men escorted Elias through a series of sterile corridors and into a private elevator. They ascended several floors before the doors opened into a lavishly furnished office suite, the panoramic windows offering a stunning view of the city skyline. The man who had greeted Elias on the dock gestured towards a large, mahogany desk where a figure sat in a high-backed leather chair, his face obscured by the shadows. As Elias approached, the chair slowly swiveled around, revealing a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His face was smooth and unreadable, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He exuded an aura of quiet power that was far more menacing than any overt display of aggression. "Mr. Vance," the man said, his voice calm and cultured, a stark contrast to the gruffness of his subordinates. "Please have a seat." He gestured to a plush armchair facing his desk. Elias sat, his senses on high alert. He recognized the type. This wasn't some street thug. This was a man who orchestrated violence from a distance, a puppet master pulling the strings. "I am Mateo Vargas," the man continued, his gaze unwavering. "I believe my associates made your acquaintance on the Oceanus." Elias met his gaze. "They did." Vargas steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "I must confess, Mr. Vance, their report of your resilience was quite remarkable. A lone engineer turning a heavily armed crew into a rabble. Impressive." There was a hint of genuine admiration in his voice, which Elias found more unsettling than any threat. "I was defending my workplace," Elias said simply. Vargas chuckled softly. "Of course, a matter of principle. I respect that. Principle is a valuable commodity in our line of work." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "However, your principles caused a significant disruption to my business, Mr. Vance. A very expensive disruption. Your business involved attacking innocent people and holding them for ransom," Elias countered, his voice hardening. Vargas's smile didn't waver. "Perspective, Mr. Vance. It's all a matter of perspective. From my perspective, it was a calculated risk, an investment that, thanks to your intervention, yielded a rather negative return." He leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more serious. "Now, normally, in such situations, we would simply rectify the situation. Eliminate the problem. You understand?" Elias nodded slowly. He knew exactly what Vargas meant. "However," Vargas continued, his eyes glinting, "I am not a man who dismisses talent. You, Mr. Vance, possess a particular set of skills. Skills that could be very useful to me." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I am offering you a proposition, Mr. Vance. An opportunity. Work for me. Your resourcefulness, your ability to think under pressure. These are qualities I value. You would be well compensated, of course, and you would never have to worry about working on another oil platform again." Elias stared at Vargas, a cold fury rising within him. "You're asking me to join the people who attacked my colleagues? Who threatened their lives?" Vargas shrugged, his expression nonchalant. "Business is business, Mr. Vance. Sentiments are a luxury we cannot afford. Think of it as a career change. You're clearly capable of more than just fixing machines." "I'm not interested," Elias said, his voice firm. Vargas's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild disappointment. "A pity. I rarely make such offers. You are a stubborn man, Mr. Vance. I admire that in a foolish sort of way." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. "However, your refusal presents a problem. You are a loose end, Mr. Vance. You know too much. You have interfered with my operations. I cannot simply let you walk away." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air growing heavy with menace. The two men who had escorted Elias stood a little straighter, their eyes fixed on him. "What are you going to do?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively clenching into a fist. Vargas sighed softly. "I was hoping we could come to an understanding, but you leave me with little choice." He picked up a sleek, silver pen from his desk and idly turned it in his fingers. "You see, Mr. Vance, you are not the only one with principles. I have a principle of my own. Anyone who crosses me will pay the price." He paused, his gaze piercing. "And sometimes, the price is not just for the person who crossed me." A chill ran down Elias's spine. He knew what Vargas was implying. "Are you threatening me?" Vargas's smile returned, but this time it was cold and predatory. "Consider it a statement of fact, Mr. Vance. You have made a powerful enemy. An enemy with resources, with reach. You might have won a battle on a floating oil rig, but you have just entered a much larger war." He stood up, his movements fluid and graceful despite his age. He walked towards the window, looking out at the city lights. "I suggest you enjoy your freedom while it lasts, Mr. Vance, because it will not last long." He turned back to Elias, his eyes like chips of ice. "My associates will escort you back. Consider this our only conversation. Next time we meet, it will be under very different circumstances." The two men stepped forward, their expressions grim. Elias knew this wasn't over. Vargas hadn't ordered his immediate death, which meant he had other plans, more insidious ways to make him pay. As he was escorted back to the SUV, Elias's mind raced. He was back on land, but he was far from safe. He had made a powerful and ruthless enemy, and he knew Vargas's threat was not idle. He had to disappear to find a way to protect himself and anyone else Vargas might target. The ride back to the harbor was even more tense than the journey to Vargas's office. Elias could feel the eyes of his escorts on him, assessing, calculating. When the SUV finally pulled up near where he had disembarked from the Oceanus, one of the men spoke. "Consider this a courtesy, engineer. Don't make us regret it." He opened the door, and Elias stepped out onto the familiar ground, the salty air of the harbor filling his lungs. He watched as the black SUV disappeared into the night, its taillights fading into the city glow. He was alone, standing on the dock, with a target on his back and a powerful cartel hunting him. He needed to move, and fast. He couldn't stay here waiting for Vargas to make his next move. He needed a plan. His mind went back to the Oceanus, the platform that had become his sanctuary, his fortress. It was damaged, out of commission, but it was also a place where he knew every inch, every hidden passage. It was a place where he had the advantage. He looked out at the harbor, the lights of the salvage tug still visible in the distance. He knew the platform was scheduled to be towed to a repair yard in the morning. He had to get back there, to prepare for the storm that was coming. He turned and started walking, his steps purposeful. He needed to find a boat, any boat that could take him back to the Oceanus. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. He found a small, privately owned fishing boat moored nearby. The owner was nowhere in sight. Elias didn't hesitate. He knew how to hotwire an engine. Within minutes, he had the boat running, its small motor sputtering to life. He cast off the mooring lines and steered the boat out of the harbor, heading back towards the dark silhouette of the Oceanus in the distance. The waves were choppy, and the wind whipped around him, but his resolve was unwavering. He was going back to his fortress. As he approached the platform, he could see the lights of the Coast Guard security detail still on board. He would have to be careful not to alert them. He cut the engine a safe distance away and paddled silently towards the platform, using a piece of driftwood he found on the boat. He reached the massive structure and carefully climbed aboard, using the mooring lines as handholds. He was back on the Oceanus. It felt strangely familiar, like coming home after a long and dangerous journey. But this time, he wasn't just the engineer. He was a warrior preparing for battle. He moved silently through the darkened corridors, his senses on high alert. He needed to find a secure location, a place where he could lay low and plan his next move. He made his way back to the engine room, the familiar hum of the emergency generator a comforting sound in the silence. The room was still a mess from his previous fight, but it offered the security and resources he needed. He secured the doors, checked his limited supplies, and began to think. Vargas's threat about targeting others weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't let that happen. He had to find a way to stop Vargas, to dismantle his operation. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. But who could he trust? The authorities were involved, but Vargas clearly had influence. He needed someone outside the system. His thoughts drifted to a name, a face from his past. Someone he hadn't seen in years, but someone he knew he could count on in a fight. A former comrade from his Marine days, a man who had disappeared off the grid, but possessed skills and connections that could be invaluable. He knew it was a long shot, but it was his only hope. He needed to find a way to contact him. He remembered a satellite phone he had stashed away in his personal locker, a relic from his time in the service. It was old and probably outdated, but it might still work. He made his way to his quarters, a small Spartan room on the upper deck. He found the locker and rummaged through his belongings until his fingers closed around the familiar weight of the satellite phone. He powered it on, his heart pounding with anticipation. The screen flickered to life, displaying a no-service message. It was dead. Frustration washed over him. He had been so close. He examined the phone more closely, looking for any signs of damage. Then he noticed a small crack in the antenna. It must have been damaged during the fight. He knew he couldn't fix it with the tools he had on hand. He needed specialized equipment. His gaze fell on the platform's communication array, the massive satellite dish mounted high above the deck. It was damaged in the initial attack, but perhaps some of the components were still functional. It was a long and dangerous climb, but he had no other options. He had to try. He made his way to the base of the communication tower and began to climb, the wind buffeting him as he ascended. The metal was cold and slippery beneath his hands. He finally reached the top, the platform stretching out below him like a giant metal beast. The satellite dish was indeed damaged, with several panels bent and broken. He examined the antenna, his heart sinking. It looked beyond repair. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something. Tucked away in a junction box, protected from the elements, was a smaller, auxiliary antenna. It was designed for emergency backup communication. His hope surged. He quickly checked the connections. They seemed intact. He carefully disconnected the damaged main antenna and connected the auxiliary antenna to the satellite phone cable. He then climbed back down the tower, his heart pounding with anticipation. He returned to his quarters and plugged the satellite phone into the cable. He powered it on again. This time, the screen flickered, then displayed a single, precious word, searching. He held his breath, his eyes glued to the screen. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the word changed to connected. He had a signal. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, his fingers trembling slightly until he found the number he was looking for. He pressed the call button and waited, the phone ringing in his ear. It rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's me," Elias said, his voice low. "I need your help." There was a moment of silence, then a surprised, disbelieving voice on the other end. "Vance? Is that really you? I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Elias replied grimly. "But I need your help to stay that way." He had made contact. He had reached out to his past. Now he just had to hope it was enough to face the future. But as he spoke to his old comrade, a flicker of movement caught his eye through the porthole window. A small, fast boat was approaching the Oceanus, cutting through the waves with alarming speed, and it wasn't flying a Coast Guard flag. The cartel was making their next move, and they weren't waiting for morning. "They're here," Elias said urgently into the satellite phone, his voice low and strained, his eyes fixed on the approaching vessel. A fast boat, no markings. "They're coming straight for the platform." "Hold on, Vance." "Who's they?" his comrade, a man named Jericho, asked, his voice instantly sharpening. "The cartel. Vargas sent them. I just left his office. He's not waiting." Elias moved quickly, peering through another porthole to track the boat's progress. It was a sleek, black speedboat, riding low in the water, with at least 3 figures visible on deck, their postures suggesting they were armed. "Damn it, Vance. I told you to lay low. Where are the Coast Guard? Still hours away. They think the threat is over. They don't know about Vargas. Listen, Jericho, I need you to move fast. They're going to try and finish the job. All right, I'm thinking. Stay put. Don't engage unless you have to. Can you get to a defensible position? I'm in my quarters now. Heading back to the engine room. It's the most secure place on this rust bucket. Elias grabbed the fire axe he had leaned against the wall. Engine room's good. Thick walls. Listen, I'm going to try and raise some people, see what I can do from this end. But you need to hold out until then. The speedboat was rapidly closing the distance to the Oceanus. Elias could now make out the glint of weapons in the hands of the figures on board. They were definitely not here for a friendly visit. They're almost here, Jericho. I gotta go. Stay on the line if you can. Elias tucked the satellite phone into his pocket, keeping the connection open. He moved swiftly out of his quarters and into the dimly lit corridor, heading towards the engine room deep within the platform. He could hear the sound of the speedboat's engines growing louder, followed by the thud of it bumping against the platform's support structure. He reached the engine room door and quickly secured the heavy bolts. Jericho, they're on board, Elias whispered into the phone. I can hear them. Sounds like 3 or 4 of them. Copy that, Vance? Stay quiet. Let them come to you. Jericho's voice was calm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline surging through Elias's veins. Elias positioned himself behind a large piece of machinery, the fire axe gripped tightly in his hands. He could hear the pirates' heavy footsteps echoing in the corridor outside, their voices low and urgent. Search this level first. He has to be here somewhere, one of them barked in Spanish. Elias held his breath, listening as the footsteps approached the engine room door. He could hear them trying the handle, then banging on the thick steel. Open up. We know you're inside, engineer. Silence from Elias. All right, break it down, the same voice ordered. Elias heard the scraping of metal against metal as the pirates tried to force the door. He knew it wouldn't hold for long. These guys were likely better equipped than the first wave. Jericho, they're trying to breach the door, Elias whispered. Can you create a diversion? Something to slow them down. Elias's eyes scanned the engine room. He thought of the high-pressure steam pipes, the same ones he had used before. Yeah, maybe. Stand by. He moved quickly to the valve on the main steam line. He could hear the pirates' efforts on the door intensifying, the metal groaning under the strain. Jericho, I'm about to release a steam blast. It'll buy me some time. Do it, Vance. Be careful. Elias took a deep breath and wrenched the valve open. A deafening hiss filled the engine room as a thick cloud of scalding steam erupted from the pipe, engulfing the space in a blinding white fog. He heard shouts of surprise and pain from the other side of the door as the pirates were hit by the blast. He quickly moved away from the steam, using the chaos to his advantage. Steam deployed, Jericho. They're not getting through that door anytime soon. Good job, Vance. Now what? Now I wait. They'll try to find another way in. There's a maintenance hatch on the other side of the engine room. I'm going to set a trap. Elias moved through the steam-filled space, his eyes watering, the heat intense. He reached the maintenance hatch and positioned a heavy metal drum filled with tools behind it, just like before. Trap set, Jericho? They'll likely try the hatch next. He retreated back behind the machinery, his fire axe ready. He could hear the pirates outside regrouping, their voices muffled by the steam. They're talking about going around, Jericho said. Sounds like they know the layout. Yeah, they probably do. Vargas wouldn't send amateurs this time. The sound of metal scraping against metal came from the direction of the maintenance hatch. They were trying to open it. Elias tensed, his grip tightening on the fire axe. He could hear the latch being worked. Suddenly, the hatch swung inwards and the metal drum behind it toppled over with a loud crash, sending tools scattering across the floor. A startled yell in Spanish echoed from the other side. Trap sprung, Jericho. Copy that, Vance. Keep your eyes peeled. They won't give up easily. Elias waited, listening to the frustrated shouts outside. He knew they would be angry and even more determined now. Then he heard a different sound, a faint scraping noise coming from above. He looked up and saw a section of the ceiling panel slowly being removed. Jericho, they're trying to come in through the ventilation shaft. Damn it, Vance. They're not messing around. Elias moved quickly, positioning himself directly beneath the opening in the ceiling. He raised the fire axe ready to strike. The panel was pulled away completely and a masked face peered down into the engine room. Before the pirate could react, Elias swung the fire axe upwards, the heavy blade connecting with a sickening thud. The pirate's body went limp and he fell back out of sight. One down, Jericho. They tried the vents. Stay alert, Vance. There could be more. Elias waited, his eyes fixed on the opening in the ceiling. After a moment, another masked figure appeared, this time holding a submachine gun. The pirate opened fire, the bullets tearing through the air where Elias had been standing moments before. Elias ducked behind the machinery, the bullets ricocheting off the metal. Jericho, I'm taking fire. They're in the vents. Can you get out of there, Vance? Negative. They've got me pinned down. Elias knew he had to act fast. He couldn't stay here and get shot to pieces. He needed to find a way to turn the tables. His eyes scanned the engine room again, desperately searching for an idea. Then he saw it, a large electrical junction box mounted on the wall nearby. It controlled the power to several sections of the platform. Jericho, I have an idea. Stand by. Elias moved quickly, dodging the stream of bullets, and reached the junction box. He ripped it open, exposing a tangle of wires. He knew that if he short-circuited the system, it could create a massive power surge, potentially disabling the pirate's equipment and giving him a chance to escape. He took a deep breath and began to yank wires, ignoring the sparks that flew around him. He could hear the pirates shouting, realizing what he was doing. Jericho, I'm about to fry the system. Get ready. Copy that, Vance. Good luck. With a final yank, Elias connected two thick wires. A blinding flash of light filled the engine room, followed by a deafening crackle and the smell of burning metal. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the engine room into darkness. Power's out, Jericho. Elias yelled over the ringing in his ears. What's your status, Vance? I'm okay. They might be too. I'm using the darkness to move. Elias fumbled for the satellite phone in his pocket. Coast Guard just called, Jericho said. They picked up your distress about the fire. ETA is now down to 1 hour. 1 hour. He just had to survive for 1 more hour. Elias moved silently through the darkness, his hand outstretched, feeling his way through the maze of machinery. He could hear the pirates moving too, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. Suddenly, he bumped into something solid. He spun around, his fire axe raised, but it was too late. He felt a sharp pain in his leg as a knife plunged into his thigh. He roared in pain and stumbled backwards, dropping the fire axe. He was wounded again, and now he was in the dark, facing an unknown number of enemies. This was getting very bad, very fast. He could hear the pirates closing in, their voices low and menacing. He was cornered, his only weapon gone, bleeding in the darkness. He had to think, and he had to think now. But all he could feel was the searing pain in his leg and the cold dread of what was to come. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the platform, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that wasn't the emergency generator. It was different, stronger, and it was getting closer. What in God's name was that? The vibration intensified, growing into a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very steel of the Oceanus. It wasn't the familiar shudder of the platform's machinery, but something far more powerful, something almost alive. The pirates, who had been closing in on Elias, momentarily paused, their footsteps faltering as they too felt the strange tremor. What the hell is that? One of them muttered in Spanish, his voice laced with confusion. Elias, despite the searing pain in his leg, recognized the sound. It was the unmistakable growl of a powerful engine, a deep, guttural roar that spoke of immense power and speed. And it was coming from beneath the platform. Suddenly, the darkness in the engine room was pierced by a series of powerful floodlights that erupted from below, bathing the space in an almost blinding glare. The pirates shielded their eyes, momentarily disoriented. Elias, however, squinted and saw the impossible. Rising slowly from the churning water beneath the platform, secured by thick cables that snaked up through the open grating in the engine room floor, was a heavily armed submersible. It was sleek and black, its hull bristling with weaponry that dwarfed the pirates' small arms. And emblazoned on its side, barely visible in the glare, was a stylized skull, the same tattoo Elias had seen on the first pirate leader. But this skull was different, more intricate, and surrounded by the words, Silent Fury. Before the pirates could react, a hatch on the submersible hissed open, and a figure in tactical gear rappelled down into the engine room, landing silently on the metal floor. He was tall and powerfully built, his face obscured by a night vision visor, and he was carrying a large, suppressed rifle. Jericho? Elias croaked, his voice filled with disbelief. The figure turned towards him, and for a fleeting moment, Elias saw a glimpse of a familiar, grizzled face beneath the visor. Took you long enough to call, Vance? Jericho's voice was low and steady, laced with a hint of amusement. The pirates, finally recovering from their shock, opened fire on Jericho. But he moved with lightning speed, his rifle barking in short, controlled bursts. The suppressed weapon made the sound eerily quiet in the vast engine room, but its effect was devastating. Two of the pirates dropped instantly, their bodies riddled with bullet holes. The remaining pirate, the one who had stabbed Elias, turned to flee. But Jericho was already on him, tackling him to the ground with brutal efficiency. In a swift movement, he disarmed the pirate and secured him with zip ties. Jericho turned back to Elias, his visor still down. "You look like hell, Vance." You came in a submarine?" Elias asked, still trying to process what he was seeing. "Something like that," Jericho replied, his tone nonchalant. "Let's just say some old friends owed me a favor. Heard you were having a bit of trouble." He moved towards Elias and quickly assessed his leg wound. "That looks nasty. Can you walk?" With help, Elias grunted, leaning heavily on Jericho. "All right, let's get you out of here. The cavalry should be arriving any minute now." Jericho gestured towards the submersible. "Our ride's waiting." As they made their way towards the submersible, Elias noticed the remaining pirate, the one Jericho had tackled, staring at the silent fury with wide, terrified eyes. He seemed to recognize the vessel. They climbed into the submersible, Jericho expertly operating the controls. The floodlights retracted and the hatch hissed shut. The powerful engines beneath them roared to life, and the silent fury began to descend back into the dark depths of the Gulf. "What was that?" Elias asked, his voice still filled with awe. "That submarine, who does it belong to?" Jericho grinned, a flash of white teeth in the dim light of the submersible. "Let's just say it belongs to people who really don't like Mateo Vargas." As the silent fury moved away from the Oceanus, the platform above was suddenly bathed in the flashing blue and red lights of approaching Coast Guard vessels. The cavalry had arrived, just as Jericho had predicted. Inside the submersible, Elias leaned back against the cushioned seat, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He was safe for now, but he knew that his encounter with Mateo Vargas was far from over. He had made a powerful enemy, and that enemy wouldn't rest until he was eliminated. "So," Elias said to Jericho, his voice weary, "what now?" Jericho looked at him, his expression serious. "Now, Vance, we take the fight to them." The submersible continued its journey through the dark waters, leaving the burning oil platform behind. Elias didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the pirates had attacked, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Jericho, and Jericho had a submarine, and apparently some very powerful friends. But as the silent fury sped through the inky blackness, a small, almost imperceptible blinking light on the submersible's control panel caught Jericho's eye. It was a tracking signal, faint but persistent. Someone knew where they were going, and it wasn't the Coast Guard. The war with Mateo Vargas had just taken a very dangerous turn. Jericho's eyes narrowed as he stared at the blinking light on the control panel. His relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by a focused intensity that Elias had only glimpsed briefly before. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "I knew it was too easy." "What is it?" Elias asked, his own sense of relief quickly dissipating. "We've got a tracker," Jericho replied, his gaze sweeping across the various readouts on the panel. "Small, military grade. Someone knew we were coming, or at least suspected it." "Vargas?" Jericho nodded grimly. "Has to be. He's thorough. Probably had a contingency plan in place in case his initial team failed." He ran a hand over his stubbled chin, his brow furrowed in thought. "This changes things." "How so?" "Our original destination was a safe house a few hundred miles offshore. We could have laid low there, regrouped, made our next move. But if they're tracking us," Jericho trailed off, his expression grim. "They'll be waiting. So what do we do?" Jericho's eyes flickered back to the control panel. "We improvise. This sub has some capabilities that aren't exactly standard issue." He tapped a series of buttons and a holographic display flickered to life, showing a detailed map of the Gulf floor. "There's an old underwater research facility about 70 miles from here," Jericho said, pointing to a location on the map. "Decommissioned years ago. Off the grid. If we can get there, we might be able to shake this tail." "Can this thing outrun them?" Elias asked, glancing nervously at the blinking light. "It's not about outrunning them, Vance. It's about being smarter than them." Jericho grinned again, but this time there was a predatory edge to it. "This sub can go deep. Real deep. Deeper than anything Vargas's people are likely to have." He adjusted the controls and the silent fury tilted downwards, its powerful engines increasing their thrum. The pressure inside the submersible subtly increased as they began their descent into the crushing depths of the Gulf. Hours passed in the cramped confines of the submersible. Elias, his leg throbbing despite the makeshift bandage, drifted in and out of sleep. Jericho remained at the controls, his vigilance unwavering, occasionally checking the tracking signal. "They're still with us," he reported grimly after one such check. "They're not as sophisticated as I hoped, though. They're following our general direction, but they don't have our exact depth or speed. We might just lose them in the canyons." The underwater research facility appeared on their sonar as a jagged anomaly on the otherwise relatively flat seabed. Jericho expertly maneuvered the Silent Fury towards it, the submersible's powerful lights cutting through the perpetual darkness of the deep ocean. The facility was a sprawling complex of interconnected modules, partially buried in the sediment, looking like the skeletal remains of some colossal deep-sea creature. Jericho guided the submersible into a large, flooded docking bay, the water swirling around them as they came to a stop. The internal pressure equalized with a soft hiss. "We're here," Jericho announced, shutting down the engines. "Let's see if this old place still has some life left in it." They donned diving gear stored in a compartment and exited the submersible into the murky water of the docking bay. The facility was eerily silent, the only sound the gentle hiss of their breathing apparatus. Jericho led the way through a series of flooded corridors, his powerful flashlight cutting through the gloom. The facility was surprisingly well preserved, with most of the equipment still intact, albeit covered in a thick layer of sediment. They reached a large control room, its banks of monitors and consoles dark and lifeless. Jericho ran his flashlight over the equipment. "Power's out, obviously, but the backup generators might still be functional." After a few tense minutes of tinkering with the corroded control panel, the emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie green glow over the room. Several of the monitors sputtered and came online, displaying schematics of the facility. "Jackpot," Jericho muttered, pointing to a diagram. "Looks like this place has its own independent power source and even a small, secure communication array." They spent the next few hours exploring the facility, finding a small living quarters with surprisingly comfortable bunks and a well-stocked emergency pantry. It seemed the researchers who had once worked here had planned for extended periods of isolation. As Elias rested his injured leg, Jericho worked on restoring the communication system. He finally managed to bring one of the consoles online, displaying a scrambled message log. "Looks like this place was shut down in a hurry," Jericho said, frowning at the screen. "Lots of encrypted data here. Might take me a while to decipher anything useful." Suddenly, a piercing alarm blared through the facility, its shrill tone echoing through the flooded corridors. "What was that?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the fire axe Jericho had given him. Jericho's eyes were glued to one of the monitors. "They found us. The tracker must have been transmitting even when we were deep. They're close." The monitor displayed a sonar image showing a vessel approaching their location on the surface. It was moving fast. "They know we're here," Jericho said grimly, "and they're not going to wait for us to surface." Another alarm began to sound, this one deeper and more urgent. Water began to flood into the docking bay where the Silent Fury was moored. "They're trying to trap us," Jericho yelled. They must have remotely activated the facility's flood control system. The water level in the docking bay was rising rapidly, threatening to submerge the submersible. "Can we get out of here?" Elias asked, his voice filled with urgency. Jericho glanced at the rising water, then back at the sonar screen. "Not through the docking bay. They'll be waiting for us on the surface. But there might be another way." He pointed to the schematics on the monitor. "There's an emergency escape tunnel that leads directly to a deep-sea trench a few miles from here. If we can reach it." The water in the docking bay was now lapping at the top of the Silent Fury. Time was running out. "Let's go," Elias said, pushing himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg. Jericho nodded, grabbing a couple of underwater scooters from a storage locker. "This way. And keep your eyes open. If they can flood this place, they can probably send divers down too." They plunged back into the murky water, the alarms still blaring around them, their flashlights cutting through the gloom as they followed Jericho through the flooded corridors, racing against the rising water and the unseen enemies who were closing in. The deep-sea research facility, meant to be their sanctuary, had become a deadly trap. And as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors, a new, chilling sound reached their ears, the distinct whirring of underwater propulsion units, growing steadily louder. Vargas's forces were already inside. The whirring of the underwater propulsion units grew louder, closer. Jericho propelled himself forward, his powerful flashlight beam dancing across the algae-covered walls of the corridor. Elias followed, the underwater scooter pulling him along, his injured leg trailing behind. The pain was a dull throb now, overshadowed by the adrenaline of the chase. "They're gaining on us," Jericho yelled through his comms, his voice distorted by the water. "That tunnel can't be much further." The corridor narrowed, forcing them to slow down. The whirring sound was almost upon them. Suddenly, two figures emerged from the gloom ahead, their own flashlights cutting through the murky water. They were clad in black wetsuits, their faces obscured by full face masks, and they were armed with spear guns. "Contact!" Jericho shouted, veering sharply to the right and disappearing into a side passage. Elias followed, narrowly avoiding a spear that whizzed past his head. The side passage was even narrower, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through with their scooters. The pursuing divers were close behind, their propulsion units whining as they navigated the tight space. "This way!" Jericho yelled, pointing to a small, circular hatch set into the wall. He wrestled it open, revealing a dark, cylindrical tunnel. "The escape route. It's going to be tight." Jericho squeezed through the hatch, abandoning his scooter. Elias followed, pushing his own scooter ahead of him. The tunnel was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a person in diving gear. The whirring of the pursuing divers was getting closer. "Hurry, Vance!" Jericho's voice echoed from the darkness ahead. Elias pushed himself forward, using his arms to propel himself through the tight tunnel. The metal walls were cold and rough against his suit. He could feel the water pressure increasing as they descended. Suddenly, the tunnel shook violently and a shower of debris rained down from the ceiling. "Cave in!" Jericho yelled. "Keep moving!" The tunnel narrowed even further, forcing Elias to ditch his scooter. He continued to push himself forward, crawling through the cramped space, his lungs burning. He could hear the muffled sounds of the pursuing divers struggling behind him. The tunnel opened into a slightly wider chamber. Jericho was waiting for him, his flashlight beam illuminating a large, reinforced door set into the far wall. "That's it!" Jericho exclaimed. "The exit to the trench." He began to work on the door's locking mechanism, a complex series of levers and dials. His movements were quick and efficient despite the pressure. Behind them, the sounds of the pursuing divers were getting closer. Elias could hear them scraping against the tunnel walls. "Hurry, Jericho!" "Almost there," Jericho grunted, his muscles straining. With a loud click, the locking mechanism disengaged. Jericho swung the heavy door open, revealing a vast, dark expanse beyond. It was the deep-sea trench, a seemingly bottomless chasm plunging into the abyss. "After you, Vance," Jericho said, gesturing towards the opening. Elias didn't hesitate. He squeezed through the doorway and found himself in the open water of the trench. The pressure was immense, the darkness absolute, broken only by the beam of his flashlight. He could feel the cold seeping into his suit. Jericho followed close behind, pulling the heavy door shut and re-engaging the locking mechanism. "That should slow them down," he said, his voice slightly strained. They activated their underwater scooters again, the small motors whirring to life in the vast silence of the deep. Jericho pointed downwards. "The trench floor is about a mile down. We need to reach a thermal vent system down there. There's a chance of finding a natural exit." They began their descent into the darkness, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. The pressure increased steadily and the temperature dropped. The only sign of life was the occasional bioluminescent creature that flickered past in the darkness. Hours passed in the oppressive silence and darkness of the trench. Elias's leg throbbed and he was starting to feel the effects of the extreme pressure. Suddenly, their sonar pinged, detecting movement below them. Several large shapes were approaching rapidly. "What is it?" Elias asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Jericho's flashlight beam danced nervously in the darkness. "Submersibles. More of Vargas's people. They must have anticipated this route." The shapes below grew larger, their powerful lights illuminating the silent fury which was resting on the trench floor a short distance away. "They're going for the sub," Jericho exclaimed. "We can't let them get their hands on that." He adjusted his scooter, accelerating downwards. Elias followed, his heart pounding in his chest. They were racing against time, descending into the crushing depths to protect their only means of escape. The submersibles below were closing in on the silent fury, their mechanical arms extending menacingly. The battle for the Oceanus might be over, but the fight for their lives had just reached a terrifying new depth. Elias and Jericho propelled themselves downwards with frantic urgency, the small motors of their scooters whirring at maximum power. The pressure around them intensified, the darkness pressing in like a physical force. Below, the lights of Vargas's submersibles grew larger, their metallic forms glinting ominously in the blackness. "They're almost there," Jericho yelled through the comms, his voice strained. "We have to cut them off." They reached the trench floor, the sediment swirling around them as they braked hard, narrowly avoiding a collision with one of the enemy submersibles. The submersibles, smaller and more agile than the Silent Fury, maneuvered quickly, their powerful lights illuminating Elias and Jericho like prey caught in a beam. One of the submersibles launched a harpoon-like projectile, the tethered weapon streaking through the water towards Jericho. He reacted instantly, swerving his scooter violently to the side, the harpoon narrowly missing him. "They're armed," Elias shouted, his heart pounding. He gripped the fire axe tightly, a ridiculously inadequate weapon in this underwater battle. "Stay behind me, Vance," Jericho yelled, pulling a small, handheld device from his belt. He activated it, and a high-pitched sonar pulse emitted, briefly disorienting the approaching submersibles. Using the momentary confusion, Jericho accelerated towards the Silent Fury, Elias following closely. They reached the submersible just as the mechanical arm of one of Vargas's vehicles was about to clamp onto its hull. "Get inside," Jericho yelled, fumbling with the Silent Fury's external hatch controls. Elias scrambled inside, his movements clumsy in the bulky diving gear. Jericho followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as the enemy submersible rammed into the Silent Fury, the impact shaking the larger vessel violently. "They're trying to breach us," Jericho exclaimed, rushing to the controls. The interior of the Silent Fury flickered to life as he powered up the systems. "Can we fight back?" Elias asked, looking around the cramped cockpit. Jericho pointed to a weapons console. "Torpedoes? Limited supply, but enough to even the odds." He began to input targeting coordinates. Outside, the battle raged. The enemy submersibles were circling the Silent Fury, their lights flashing, their sonar pinging relentlessly. They were like a pack of wolves attacking a wounded bear. "Locking on target," Jericho said, his finger hovering over the launch button. "Firing torpedo 1. A low rumble vibrated through the Silent Fury, followed by a whoosh as a torpedo shot out into the darkness. The sonar screen showed the projectile streaking towards one of the enemy submersibles. There was a bright flash, followed by a secondary explosion. "One down." The remaining submersible reacted quickly, firing another harpoon, this time targeting the Silent Fury's propulsion unit. The harpoon struck home and a jolt ran through their vessel. "We've been hit," Elias yelled. "Damage report." Jericho checked the readouts. "Minor damage to the propulsion. We can still move, but we're slower." The enemy submersible pressed its attack, maneuvering closer and attempting to use its mechanical arm to disable the Silent Fury's weapons systems. Jericho expertly piloted their vessel, dodging the clumsy attempts and trying to get a clear shot. "Torpedo 2 ready," he announced. Firing. Another torpedo streaked out into the darkness, but this time the enemy pilot was more skilled. The submersible executed a sharp evasive maneuver and the torpedo missed its target. "Damn it," Jericho cursed. "We're running out of options." Suddenly, the Silent Fury's sonar detected a massive, slow-moving object approaching from the depths. It was huge, dwarfing even their own submersible. "What is that?" Elias asked, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and awe. Jericho stared at the sonar screen, his eyes wide. "I don't know, it's massive, bigger than anything I've ever seen down here." The massive object continued to approach, its presence on the sonar screen growing larger with each passing second. The enemy submersible also seemed to have detected it, its movements becoming erratic. Then, the unthinkable happened. The massive object collided with the remaining enemy submersible with a deafening crunch, the force of the impact sending tremors through the Silent Fury. The enemy vessel was instantly crushed, its lights going dark. Silence descended into the trench, broken only by the hum of the Silent Fury's damaged propulsion system. The massive object on the sonar screen began to move away, disappearing back into the inky blackness. Jericho and Elias stared at each other in stunned silence. They had been on the verge of defeat, and now their enemy was gone, taken out by something unknown and colossal from the depths. What was that?" Elias finally managed to ask, his voice a mere whisper. Jericho shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the sonar screen. "I have no idea, Vance. Some kind of deep-sea creature, maybe? Something we're not supposed to know about." He took a deep breath, his gaze returning to the controls. "Whatever it was, it saved our lives. But we're not out of the woods yet. Vargas knows we're down here. He'll send more. He looked at Elias, his expression grim. We need to get out of this trench and fast. That thermal vent system is our only hope. Jericho engaged the damaged propulsion and the Silent Fury began to move slowly across the trench floor, leaving the wreckage of the enemy submersibles behind. The encounter with the colossal creature had been terrifying and inexplicable, a stark reminder of the unknown dangers that lurked in the deepest parts of the ocean. And as they limped away, a new, more ominous presence appeared on their sonar, multiple contacts approaching rapidly from the surface, descending quickly. Vargas was indeed sending more. And this time, they wouldn't be in small submersibles. They would be in something much bigger, something that could reach them even in the crushing depths of the abyss. They're bigger, Jericho said grimly, his eyes scanning the rapidly approaching contacts on the sonar. Much bigger. Probably deep-sea interceptors. Vargas isn't taking any chances. The Silent Fury was struggling, its damaged propulsion system limiting their speed. The thermal vent system was still a considerable distance away, marked on their navigation system as a cluster of jagged peaks on the seabed. Can we make it? Elias asked, his voice filled with concern. Jericho clenched his jaw. It's going to be close. This old girl has taken a beating. He diverted power to the stealth systems, hoping to make them less detectable. The pursuing vessels were gaining on them quickly, their sonar signatures growing stronger. Elias could feel the tension in the cramped cockpit, the weight of their desperate situation pressing down on them. They finally reached the edge of the thermal vent system. The seabed transformed into a chaotic landscape of towering rock formations, steaming vents spewing superheated water into the frigid depths, and strange, bioluminescent life clinging to the volcanic rock. This is it, Jericho said, expertly maneuvering the Silent Fury through the treacherous terrain. We need to use the vents to mask our signature and lose them in this maze. The submersible weaved through the labyrinthine network of hydrothermal vents, the temperature inside fluctuating wildly as they passed near plumes of superheated water. The sonar screen was a chaotic mess of echoes, making it difficult for their pursuers to pinpoint their exact location. Suddenly, a powerful sonar pulse slammed into the Silent Fury, momentarily disabling their own sensors. They've got us, Elias yelled. Hold on. Jericho slammed the controls, sending the submersible into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding a torpedo that streaked past overhead. They're firing blind, Jericho exclaimed. They can't see us clearly in this mess. He steered the Silent Fury into a narrow crevice between two towering rock formations, the submersible scraping against the sides. The pursuing vessels, unable to follow, overshot their position. We lost them for now, Jericho said, his breathing heavy. But they know we're in this area. They'll be searching. He pointed to a particularly large thermal vent, spewing a thick cloud of superheated, mineral-rich water. We're going in there. Are you crazy? Elias asked. That's boiling. It'll mask our thermal signature completely, Jericho explained. It's our only chance. He carefully guided the Silent Fury into the plume of superheated water. The temperature inside the submersible soared, the air becoming thick and stifling. The sensors went haywire, displaying nothing but static. They waited in the oppressive heat for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the hiss of the vents and their own ragged breathing. Finally, Jericho eased the submersible out of the plume. The sensors slowly returned to normal. The sonar screen was clear. We lost them, he said, a hint of relief in his voice. They have no idea where we went. Now what? Elias asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Jericho consulted the navigation system. There's a large underwater cave system connected to these vents. It's uncharted, but according to the old research data, it might have a back entrance to the surface, somewhere in international waters. A cave? It's a long shot, Vance, but it's the only way out of this trench without being spotted. Jericho steered the Silent Fury towards the indicated location, a dark opening in the side of a massive rock formation. They entered the cave system, the submersible's lights cutting through the darkness, revealing a vast network of underwater tunnels and caverns. The journey through the cave system was long and perilous. The tunnels were narrow and winding, filled with sharp rocks and unexpected drops. Jericho expertly navigated the treacherous terrain, his skill as a pilot evident. Finally, after hours of navigating the darkness, they saw a faint light ahead. It grew steadily brighter as they approached, revealing an opening that led upwards towards the surface. We made it, Jericho said, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. We're out of the trench. The Silent Fury ascended slowly towards the surface, the pressure gradually decreasing. When they finally broke through the waves, they found themselves in the open ocean, the sun setting on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. They had escaped, but their ordeal was not over. As they surfaced, they spotted a large ship in the distance, its silhouette unmistakable. It was a heavily armed cartel vessel, undoubtedly searching for them. "They're still out there," Elias said grimly. Jericho nodded. "But we have a head start. And now we're on our terms." He reached for the submersible's external communication system. "It's time to call in some favors." Hours later, as the cartel ship continued its search, the Silent Fury, now on the surface and running silent, rendezvoused with a larger, unmarked vessel. As Elias and Jericho transferred to the new ship, they were greeted by a group of heavily armed men and women, their faces grim and determined. "Welcome aboard, Vance," a woman with steely eyes said, extending her hand. "Jericho told us what happened. We've been waiting for a chance to hit Vargas where it hurts." It turned out that Jericho's old friends were part of a clandestine organization that had been fighting the cartel for years. They had the resources, the intelligence, and the firepower to take on Mateo Vargas. Over the next few days, Elias and Jericho worked with the organization, providing them with everything they knew about Vargas's operations, his network, and his weaknesses. The information Elias had gathered on the Oceanus, combined with Jericho's connections, proved invaluable. Finally, the day came for their counterstrike. A fleet of heavily armed vessels, including Jericho's Silent Fury, converged on Vargas's main headquarters, a heavily fortified island in the Caribbean. The assault was swift and decisive. The organization's forces, well-trained and highly motivated, overwhelmed Vargas's defenses. Elias, armed and ready, fought alongside Jericho, his skills honed by his time in the Marines and his desperate fight on the Oceanus. They finally cornered Mateo Vargas in his lavish penthouse suite, overlooking the chaos below. He was a broken man, his empire crumbling around him. "It's over, Vargas," Elias said, his voice cold and hard. Vargas looked at him, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat. "You may have won this battle, engineer," he spat, "but the war is far from over." "Maybe," Elias replied, "but your part in it is." Vargas was taken into custody, his reign of terror finally at an end. The cartel's operations were dismantled, their network shattered. Elias, weary but victorious, stood on the deck of one of the vessels, watching as the sun rose over the Caribbean Sea. He had come to the Oceanus as a simple engineer, seeking solitude. He was leaving as something more, a survivor, a fighter, a man who had faced darkness and emerged into the light. He looked at Jericho, who stood beside him, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "What now, Vance?" Elias looked out at the endless horizon. "Now," he said, "we find some peace." The story ends here, with the immediate threat of Mateo Vargas neutralized and Elias finding a semblance of peace after his ordeal. While the possibility of future conflicts with the remnants of the cartel might linger, the central conflict of the story arc has reached its resolution.